So today we have Richard Giragosian, who is an American Armenian, and some years ago came to live in Yerevan, and in the process, over the last decade or so, has become, in my opinion, the foremost analyst of Armenians' role in the world and in Armenian foreign policy. And he's the founding director of the Regional Studies Center, RSC, an independent think tank here. He's currently teaching at the NATO Defense College in Rome. He's been a consultant. He's been writing in all kinds of publications. I won't go through all of these things. He's quoted in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, etc. And today, Richard will be speaking about Western engagement in the South Caucasus. Richard.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back, but welcome to Armenia. I have a tremendous opportunity, but also a benefit. I see, based on the program, you've already had a very intense, insightful, and interesting number of discussions, including with the most famous, Tom DeWall. Welcome, Tom. Good to see you. But turning to our specific focus today, I'd like to present an overview of Western engagement in Armenia, Western engagement with Armenia. What I would like to do differently is to reflect the new definition of the West. In other words, the United States is now very different than it traditionally has been. And in terms of Western engagement, the EU is playing much more of a role. So I will begin with sketching US engagement and then turning to EU engagement when we're looking at the West in general. And in terms of format, I will try to present some insightful, if not provocative, analytical points. But the real interesting part, as Sam knows well, is in the question and answer period, the discussion period. But turning first to the U.S. aspect of Western engagement, there are, unfortunately, significant and serious questions challenging the traditional Western or U.S. approach to not just Eurasia, but to U.S. foreign policy and international affairs. And I do think it's important in understanding Trump's America, or better assessing the Trump administration. I'm going to try to be as objective as possible, but as a Democrat and a former Senate staffer for a decade, I will be perhaps very frank. First of all, in terms of the U.S. aspect of Western engagement in Armenia, there are, I would say, two distinct characteristics of the Trump administration's approach. First, of course, is the ideology, America first, or the MAGA ideology, making America great again. In terms of the U.S. approach, especially in terms of international affairs and foreign policy, there is a notable attraction to authoritarian leaders. President Trump, as we know, has specific affinity for Presidents Putin, Erdogan, the leaders of El Salvador, North Korea, the former president of Brazil. Authoritarian leadership, unfortunately, exercises a degree of attraction for Washington. The second element of U.S. engagement is determined by the model of governance in Washington. U.S. foreign policy has become transactional, and in many ways, everything is a deal for the Trump administration, from Iran to North Korea, China, even Canada. What this also means is the U.S. aspect of Western foreign policy or engagement is based on a degree of volatility, unpredictable governance. The real intent in Washington is disruption and destruction. And in terms of style, everything is personal in Washington. It's not even political, it's personal. Loyalty over competence. The reason I devote so much attention in my opening to understanding the nature of Washington is to understand why the EU, as the other pillar of Western engagement, needs to do more, whether it's in Ukraine, dealing with Russia, or in Armenia and the South Caucasus. But if we look at the implications from the United States, from the Trump administration on the South Caucasus in particular, there are three very different, distinct responses to the Trump administration. For Armenia, there are very few direct implications, I would argue, largely because the Armenian American political constituency, its sophisticated advocacy and lobbying power, relies on Congress, not the White House. And in this context, U.S.-Armenian relations are not directly disrupted or affected. For neighboring Azerbaijan, the re-election of Trump was fantastic news, simply because it means human rights and democracy are no longer important as benchmarks for U.S. engagement. I would also argue for Georgia and for the current Georgian government, the re-election of Trump was a welcome development because it seemingly confirms the Georgian government's accommodation of Russia and move away from the European Union, which they see as compatible with the Trump administration. For Armenia and the region, the implications from Washington are more indirect but also regional. For example, the U.S. approach or policy toward Russia, and more lately toward Iran, they are the more significant trends in terms of impacting the region. What we also see is the global situation, where the United States under Trump is now questioning traditional aspects or foundations of U.S. foreign policy, for example, the relevance of the NATO alliance, as well as the global international system of trade. In this context, we also see the Americans having little patience for multilateralism or alliances. And for a country like Armenia, or our neighbors, Georgia and Azerbaijan, this is matched by the unpredictable nature of dealing with the U.S. Therefore, it's the European Union that is more significant as the actor engaging in this region, especially because the likely scenario to come is the Trump administration accommodating Russian interests and giving the post-Soviet space to Russia as a sphere of influence. That's the real danger. That's increasingly likely. For EU engagement, Armenia has a tremendous advantage, and that is in terms of demonstrable democratic credentials, where Armenia is now endowed with a rare commodity of legitimacy. That commodity is very important, not just because of two back-to-back free and fair elections, but because of a new social contract. And unfortunately, Armenia's neighbors are moving in the other directions. For Armenia, developments in Georgia are especially distressing and destructive. The Georgian government is increasingly turning away from the European Union and Western ideals. And for Armenia, the danger of losing Georgia on that trajectory is the threat of isolation. Armenia will become more vulnerable going it alone. Azerbaijan, increasingly, is more of a Central Asian state based on its energy, based on its nature of the father-to-son dynasty, which is very Shakespearean. Lady Macbeth is Mrs. Aliyev. And in this context, Armenia is increasingly more isolated, more alone, more vulnerable. For the Armenian strategy as well, European Union engagement is also most attractive because it's less provocative to Russia. In other words, deepening ties with the EU is not the same in Russian eyes as NATO expansion or US military relations. In this context, it's also seen as less provocative. Looking at the broader picture of Armenia's engagement with the West, and not just the Western engagement with Armenia, this is not new. In fact, it's not even limited to the current government. It predates the Pashinyan government. Armenia, at one time, now a footnote in history, had an association agreement with the EU. Unfortunately, in the year 2013, the previous Armenian government was forced to sacrifice the association agreement and instead join Putin's prison, the Eurasian Economic Union. And recovering from that, in November 2017, 4 years later, Armenia was afforded a rare second chance to rebuild and regain relations with the European Union. And that's what we have now, SEPA, the Comprehensive Enhanced Partnership Agreement, which is a light version of an association agreement without the DCFTA, Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement. Against that backdrop, we now have the Armenian government talking about aspirations to join the EU. I'm very skeptical, simply for the basic contradiction where Armenia's membership in the Eurasian Economic Union inherently prevents EU membership. And I don't see this as very viable or realistic. However, the Armenian government, in my opinion, is engaged in an effective and somewhat impressive strategic bluff, using the talk of EU aspirations for two other purposes. One is to consolidate pro-Western public opinion going into an election year and to prevent any resurgence by Russia. Second, it's designed to give Armenia a rare commodity to trade with Russia. In other words, at some future point, the Armenian government negotiating with Russia can offer to close the issue, to rule out EU membership in exchange for something else. Because the problem or challenge for Armenia's transactional approach with Russia is we don't have much that Russia wants or needs. This is a rare example of a strategic bluff giving us more leverage with Russia. Having said that, we do see two demonstrable achievements between Armenia and the EU, both of which are unprecedented, and hence the importance. The first came in February 2023, the deployment of an EU monitoring mission in Armenia was especially significant because Armenia is still a country which has a Russian military base, that's a member of the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Despite this, the EU, in the first time in its history, has committed to deploying EU monitors to Armenia. The second notable achievement was extending the so-called EPF, the European Peace Facility, which is a mechanism created for Ukraine, but now has provided 10 million euros in assistance to Armenia in the security and defense sectors. It is the first time the EU has directly provided security, hard security assistance to Armenia. This 10 million euros is more significant than the number and does represent, with the deployment of the EU monitors, a demonstrable European commitment to Armenian post-war security. And in conclusion, there is no conclusion. This is very much a dynamic, not static process. But I do want to stop here and now go into more detail into what particular aspects reflect your personal and professional interests in terms of EU or US engagement in the region. So if you can identify yourself prior to posing your question or comment.
I think Richard means not just your name, but what
Your
your interest
background,
is
yeah.
and background. Yeah.
Not your horoscope or anything like that, but yeah.